Before prisons had cameras, some punishments were never meant to be seen. Men were chained, worked, and forgotten in America's darkest labor camps. Stay with us and subscribe as we uncover a true story history tried to bury. The man collapsed face first into the red dirt, the iron chain snapping tight around his ankle. The other prisoners could not stop. They were chained to him. The guard raised his rifle and shouted for them to keep moving. The sun burned overhead. Sweat poured into their eyes. The man on the ground did not move again. No doctor came. No report was written. By nightfall, his body was dragged off the road and buried without a name. This was not a battlefield. This was a prison chain gang in the American South. And this was legal. But how did punishment become something so deadly, and who allowed it to happen? That story begins years earlier, after the Civil War, when the South was desperate to rebuild and hungry for free labor. After slavery ended, Southern states faced a problem. Plantations were damaged, roads were broken, rail lines needed rebuilding, but there was no longer a free workforce to do the labor. Lawmakers found a solution hiding inside the justice system. New laws appeared. Small crimes now carried heavy punishment. A man could be arrested for not having work papers, for standing in the wrong place, for speaking back. Once convicted, prisoners were sent not to cells, but to labor camps. These camps were called chain gangs. Prisoners were locked together with iron chains and forced to work outside all day. They broke rocks, dug roads, cut trees. They slept in open cages. They ate little food. Guards carried rifles and whips. Escape was almost impossible. Many prisoners were there for minor crimes. Some had stolen food. Some had argued with a landlord. Some were arrested during police sweeps and given no real trial. Once sentenced, they disappeared into the system. Death was common. Men collapsed from heat. Infections spread from untreated wounds. Beatings were routine. If a prisoner slowed down, the entire chain was punished. If one man fell, the others were dragged with him. Officials claimed the system built discipline. They said it saved money. They said prisoners deserved it. But the truth was darker. County records show men dying within weeks of arrival. Families were never told where their loved ones went. Graves were unmarked. Names were lost. Some camps had death rates higher than battlefields from the Civil War. Journalists who tried to investigate were blocked. Guards lied. Wardens destroyed records. The camps operated far from towns, hidden in forests and fields. One camp in Georgia became especially feared. Prisoners whispered about it at night. Men sent there were rarely seen again. Even guards avoided talking about what happened behind its fences. Then, one summer morning, something went wrong. A prisoner refused to stand up. The chain did not move. The guard raised his weapon. And what happened next would finally force the outside world to look inside the chain gang system. But the cost of that moment would be paid in blood. The guard pulled the trigger.
The sound cracked across the work camp like thunder. The chain jumped. Birds scattered from the trees. Every man froze in place, even though freezing meant punishment. The prisoner who had refused to stand fell backward into the dust. The iron around his ankle rattled as his body went still. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the warden shouted for work to continue. The body was dragged away before noon. By sunset, the chain gang was back on the road, breaking rocks like nothing had happened. That was how death worked in the camps. Fast, quiet, forgotten. But this time, something changed. One of the prisoners had seen everything. He was older than most, a railroad worker before his arrest. He had learned to read and write, and he understood something dangerous. What happened that morning was not just cruelty, it was murder. That night, Inside the wooden cage where the prisoners slept, he whispered to the others. He told them the guard had no right to shoot. He said people outside needed to know. Most men stayed silent. Silence kept you alive. But one young prisoner listened closely. The next day, that young man collapsed. He was not shot, he was beaten. The guards said he fell. The prisoners knew better. The message was clear. Speak, and you will not survive. Still, the older man did not stop. Chain gangs were not run by chance. They were run for profit. Counties leased prisoners to private companies, lumber firms, mining operations, road crews. The companies paid the state. The state supplied the prisoners. If a man died, he was replaced. To the system, prisoners were tools. This is why abuse was allowed to grow. Guards were often untrained and poorly paid. Many were hired for their toughness, not their judgment. Some enjoyed the power. Others followed orders because refusing meant losing their job. Prisoners worked from sunrise to sunset. Food was thin and often spoiled. Medical care did not exist. If a man was sick, he worked. If he collapsed, he was beaten awake. If he died, his name was crossed off a list. One former guard later admitted that the chains were the worst part. If one man tripped, the others fell with him. Ankles bled, bones cracked. Guards blamed the prisoners for slowing down. In the summer heat, the chains burned skin. Deaths increased during these months. Heat exhaustion, infection, accidents that were never investigated. Some bodies were buried near the camps. Others were sent home in boxes with no explanation. Families asked questions. They were ignored. But pressure was building. Local farmers started to complain that the smell of bodies was drifting from nearby camps. A preacher noticed missing men from his church. A newspaper editor received an unsigned letter describing the shooting. At first, he did not believe it. Then another letter arrived, and another. Each one described the same camp, the same road crew, the same guard. The editor sent a reporter south. What the reporter found shocked him. He saw men chained together like animals. He saw scars. He saw fear. When he tried to speak to prisoners, guards stepped in front of him. When he asked for records, the warden laughed. That night, someone warned him to leave town. He stayed. The next morning, the reporter followed the chain gang at a distance. He saw a man stumble. He saw the guard raise his rifle. This time, the reporter shouted. The guard stopped. For a second, the system hesitated. That pause would change everything, because now there was a witness from the outside. But before the story could be printed, the reporter vanished, and the chain gang kept marching. They found the reporter's hat first. It was lying near the road, crushed into the mud by wagon wheels. His notebook was gone. His camera was missing. The local sheriff said the man had moved on. No arrest was made. No search was ordered. But the newspaper noticed the silence. Days passed, then weeks. The editor knew something was wrong. He had printed stories before about corruption and abuse, and he recognized the pattern. When people disappear, it usually means someone powerful wants them gone. So he published the letters anyway. The article did not name every guard or every camp, but it described the chains, the beatings, the deaths, and the shooting. It described men worked until they collapsed and buried without names. It described a system that treated prisoners as tools, not people. The reaction was explosive. Church leaders spoke out. Northern newspapers reprinted the story. Reform groups demanded answers. State officials denied everything. But now, eyes were watching. Too many eyes. Investigators were finally sent to inspect the camps. What they found confirmed the worst fears.
Men with infected wounds still working, chains cutting into skin, records that did not match the number of prisoners alive, graves with no markers, guards who admitted, quietly, the deaths were expected.
One investigator wrote that the camps were worse than animals would endure. Public pressure grew. Some states began to limit chain gangs. A few camps were shut down. Certain leasing contracts were canceled. On paper, reform had begun. But the system did not disappear. It changed shape. Chain gangs continued in many southern states well into the 20th century. Some prisoners were no longer leased to private companies, but they were still chained together, still beaten, still worked until their bodies gave out. As for the men who died, justice never came. No guard was charged for the shooting that started the letters. No warden went to prison. The graves remained unmarked. Families never received answers. The reporter was never found. Historians believe he was killed for what he saw, another victim of a system built on silence. His name faded, but his work did not. Because of him, the truth escaped the fences. And yet, the question remains. How many men died before anyone cared? How many were buried without names? And how many systems today still hide behind the word discipline? Because when punishment becomes profit and silence is enforced by fear, history has a way of repeating itself. And somewhere in forgotten soil along old southern roads, the chains are still waiting to be remembered. The chains did not disappear. They just grew quieter. After the investigations, officials promised change. New rules were written. Inspections were announced. Some camps were moved farther from public roads. On paper, the worst abuses were corrected. But for the men still locked together by iron, nothing felt different. Work began before sunrise. A whistle blew, chains clanked, bare feet hit cold ground. Guards watched closely, not with care, but with suspicion. Any pause looked like defiance. Any weakness looked like rebellion. One former inmate later said the fear was worse than the work. You never knew when a guard would snap. You never knew when someone on your chain would collapse and pull you down with him. You never knew if that would be your last day alive. Some prisoners tried to fight back in small ways. They shared water. They helped injured men walk. They whispered prayers at night. These tiny acts of kindness were dangerous. Guards punished cooperation because it built strength. And strength was something the system did not want prisoners to have. By the early 1900s, photographs of chain gangs began to appear in newspapers. Americans saw men in stripes, shackled together, working under rifles. Many were shocked. Others said the prisoners deserved it. The country was split. Reformers pushed harder. They argued that punishment should not mean slow death. They said prison should correct behavior, not destroy bodies. They warned that abuse inside prisons would spread violence back into society. Some states listened, others did not. Chain gangs survived in parts of the South for decades. In some places, they lasted into the 1950s. Even when chains were removed, forced labor remained. The system changed names, but not always behavior. Today, many of the camps are gone. The roads are still there. People drive over them without knowing who built them, without knowing how many men collapsed on that soil, without knowing how many bodies were buried nearby, unmarked and unnamed. There are no monuments for most of the dead, no plaques, no apologies. Their punishment ended long ago, but their stories were never told. Until now. Because remembering is a form of justice, and once the truth is heard, it cannot be chained again. But the final question still hangs in the air, heavy and uncomfortable. If a system once used discipline as an excuse for death, how sure are we that it never happens again? The last chain gang did not end with a loud announcement. There was no final whistle, no public apology, no list of the dead read out loud. It ended quietly, the same way it had lived. One camp closed, then another. Chains were removed in some places, replaced with rules that looked cleaner on paper. Guards were told to act differently. States said they had learned their lesson. But the men who survived carried the lesson in their bodies. Years later, some of them spoke. Their voices were soft. Many still feared punishment, even though they were free. They talked about the heat, the hunger, the sound of chains scraping the ground. They talked about watching friends collapse and never stand again. They talked about being treated like they were already dead. Historians began to count. Records were broken or missing, but the numbers were still terrifying. Thousands of men passed through chain gangs. No one knows how many died. Some estimates say tens of thousands suffered serious injury or death through forced labor, abuse, and neglect. Most were poor. Many were arrested for small crimes. Many never received real trials. The system did not ask if they were guilty. It only asked if their bodies could work. When the public finally turned away from chain gangs, it was not because every life mattered. It was because the image became uncomfortable, because photographs reached living rooms, because newspapers told stories that could no longer be ignored. Change came slowly, too slowly for the men already buried. Today, there are no chains on ankles in most American prisons, but the questions raised by chain gangs never went away. How much punishment is too much? Who watches the watchers? What happens when people are hidden from view? History shows us something clear. When prisoners are treated like less than human, abuse grows. When systems profit from punishment, suffering becomes normal. When silence is enforced, death follows. The roads built by chain gangs still exist. People drive them every day. Children play near them. Few know what lies beneath the ground. Bones, chains, stories that were never meant to be told. But telling them now matters, because forgetting makes it easier for cruelty to return, and remembering gives a voice to those who were never allowed to speak. Deadly discipline was once accepted. It was once defended. It was once called justice. Now we know what it really was. The last chain gang did not end with a loud announcement. There was no final whistle, no public apology, no list of the dead read out loud. It ended quietly, the same way it had lived. One camp closed, then another. Chains were removed in some places, replaced with rules that looked cleaner on paper. Guards were told to act differently. States said they had learned their lesson. But the men who survived carried the lesson in their bodies. Years later, some of them spoke. Their voices were soft. Many still feared punishment, even though they were free. They talked about the heat, the hunger, the sound of chains scraping the ground. They talked about watching friends collapse and never stand again. They talked about being treated like they were already dead. Historians began to count. Records were broken or missing, but the numbers were still terrifying. Thousands of men passed through chain gangs. No one knows how many died. Some estimates say tens of thousands suffered serious injury or death through forced labor, abuse, and neglect. Most were poor. Many were arrested for small crimes. Many never received real trials. The system did not ask if they were guilty. It only asked if their bodies could work. When the public finally turned away from chain gangs, it was not because every life mattered. It was because the image became uncomfortable, because photographs reached living rooms,
because newspapers told stories that could no longer be ignored. Change came slowly, too slowly for the man already buried. Today, there are no chains on ankles in most American prisons, but the questions raised by chain gangs never went away. How much punishment is too much? Who watches the watchers? What happens when people are hidden from view? History shows us something clear. When prisoners are treated like less than human, abuse grows. When systems profit from punishment, suffering becomes normal. When silence is enforced, death follows.
The roads built by chain gangs still exist. People drive them every day. Children play near them. Few know what lies beneath the ground. Bones, chains, stories that were never meant to be told. But telling them now matters, because forgetting makes it easier for cruelty to return, and remembering gives a voice to those who were never allowed to speak. Deadly discipline was once accepted. It was once defended. It was once called justice. Now we know what it really was, and knowing the truth is the final act of resistance against it. The chains are gone, but the silence they created still lingers. Long after the last camp closed, the land kept its memory. Old roads curved through southern towns, smooth and ordinary, hiding the truth beneath their surface. People drive them to work, children ride bikes on them. Few know these paths were carved by men in irons, pushed forward by fear and hunger. Some names survived in court papers and church logs. Most did not. Records were lost, burned, or never written at all. For every story that reached the public, many more stayed buried with the men who lived them. The system did not just punish bodies, it erased lives. Years later, a former inmate stood before a small crowd and spoke for the first time. His voice shook as he described the sound of chains at dawn. He described the heat, the beatings, the way guards looked past dying men as if they were already gone. When he finished, no one clapped. They just stood there, quiet, realizing what had been allowed to happen. That moment mattered, because truth does not need chains to survive. It only needs someone willing to speak. Historians now agree that Southern chain gangs were not accidents or mistakes. They were built by law, protected by courts, fueled by profit. They existed because society decided some lives were worth less than roads and railways. And when a system decides that, cruelty becomes routine. The end of chain gangs did not mean the end of suffering inside prisons. It meant the suffering became harder to see. Walls replaced fields, paperwork replaced whips. The pain moved indoors, away from the public eye. That is why remembering matters. Because history warns us that when punishment is hidden, it grows stronger. When prisoners are unseen, they are easier to forget. And when we forget, we allow the same ideas to return under new names. Deadly discipline was once defended as order. Abuse was once called justice. Death was once explained as necessary. Now we know better. These stories are not told to shame the past, but to protect the future. To remind us that laws without compassion can become weapons, that silence can be deadly, and that progress only happens when the truth is faced, not buried. Somewhere along those old southern roads, the ground still holds iron stains from rusted chains. They are quiet now, but they are not gone. They wait for us to remember. And as long as we do, the men who were chained there are no longer invisible. This is where the story ends, but the history does not. These men lost their voices, but their story must not be lost. If this truth mattered to you, help keep it alive. Subscribe now for real American crime stories history tried to erase.